Chapter 11 is on health, aging, and the life course. And so this chapter begins by noting that globally, populations are becoming older. There are some regional trends where there are some nations that have a much higher life expectancy and average age in their population than other nations. And why there are these differences, you can relate back to our previous discussion on the demographic transition and the fact that, we can look at birth rate, death rate, and kind of the reasons for changes in birth rate and the reasons for changes in death rate. And we can classify different societies as being stage 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And so for the United States and a lot of our high income nations like Japan, France, the UK, birth rate is low, but death rate is also low. And this is because of family planning, the improving status of women, later marriages, that kind of explains the low birth rate, the low death rate, good health care, largely sanitary living conditions, and the shift from, acute diseases, that kill people, that had a higher mortality rate and killed people quickly to, chronic diseases where people live longer, even if they are living sicker. But, that's kind of where we are. So, we have, uh, more older people in our country than countries that have not kind of reached stage 4. People who are perhaps in stage 2, or people who are in stage 3, where their birth rate is high or falling and their death rate is falling, but is perhaps maybe still higher than what it is in the United States. And oftentimes these are countries where acute illnesses play a large role in their higher mortality rate than what we see in high income nations. So, in the United States, if you're looking at this graph that shows kind of proportion of selected age groups, you can kind of see that kind of similar to Europe, but not quite to that extent. We are at the point where young people and older people are almost at parity, meaning that we have just as many older people over the age of 65 in our country as we have younger people under the age of 15. And so this chapter focuses on those older people. What are the issues and challenges of an aging society, as well as sociologically, what does it mean to be an older person in society? So let's just really kind of, confront the fact that, there is this distinction between biological age and social age. So, biological age is, how old are you? You were born at a specific time on a specific day, and then you thus are 1 year older, every single year when you reach that day. So biological age, is kind of clear cut. But social age is less clear, because that kind of relates to, what are the social constructions around age? What does it mean to be old in your given society at this time? Because the answer to that question is going to vary, based on a lot of factors. And your book kind of acknowledges that, when it says that aging is a complex mix of personal biography, social structure, and cultural perceptions of age. And so there are kind of 3 factors, influencing, that process: biology, psychology, and the social. So if you're thinking about, how we classify, kind of what the kind of contemporary classification of age is, or the elderly in particular is, certainly one that is kind of a popular definition in a lot of life course models is the one that I'm describing here, where we consider people to be older from age 65 on, and then we break those older years into kind of two groups. There are the transitional older years, which is 65 to 74. And it's during this time period that, we are expecting people to, somewhat pull back from full-time paid employment, that if they're not fully retired and negotiating, what their life is going to be like in post-retirement, what are they going to be spending their time doing? If they're not fully retired, it's during this time period that we expect them to somewhat be moving towards that. And then there are the later older years, age 75 on. And it's just kind of worth noting that, for a long period of time, there wasn't a lot of study on later older years, because oftentimes the focus was on, during this time period of people's life, perhaps they are experiencing, challenges related to their health, maybe they have, experiencing declines, in their physical as well as their mental health, their social health, because the expectation is that their peers, their partner perhaps are dying, if not already dead. But that's kind of a dated outlook, because due to increases in health technology, advances in healthcare, better living conditions, in some cases, healthier lifestyles. What we've seen in this country is an increase in centenarians, people over the age of 100, and even super centenarians, people over the age of 110. And so that kind of means that, as opposed to 75 being seen as, okay, well, this is definitely the last lap of your life, time for you to start, wrapping things up and focusing on dying. There are a growing number of people in this country who at 75 still have, 20, 25, 30, 35 years of living left. And what we're going to talk about in this presentation is that assumption that those years are necessarily going to be low quality or lonely or problematic. It kind of, that assumption is kind of based in our own biases around aging. That is not a necessity. And we'll talk about what makes that more or less likely, which unsurprisingly is related to other social identities. One thing to note is that, when we are talking about older, the older population, the gender gap becomes very sizable. And that's just because the life expectancy rates between men and women of pretty much all racial, ethnic groups, and as well as all socioeconomic statuses, pretty much across the board, women outlive men. And by the time we get to our centenarians, that gender gap is 9-1. So there is a kind of significant female advantage there. As I suggested, some of our assumptions about what it's like to be older are based less on empiricism and more on bias. And your book touches on this when it talks about ageism, a set of beliefs originating in biological variation related to the aging process and the actions of corporate bodies and their agents and the resulting views of ordinary people. Ageism generates and reinforces fear and denigration of the aging process and stereotypes regarding competence and the need for protection. Ageism legitimizes systematic discrimination based on age. So a fancy way of just saying that, culturally we have kind of created, this belief system that has a negative derogatory view of elderly people, and we underestimate their capacity for competency. And then this shapes not just how we see them, but how we treat them in a kind of a variety of settings and contexts. So, let's break that kind of mouthful down a little bit further. So, one element of ageism is related to prejudice, and the fact that we prejudge people based on their age categories, and that we have age-based stereotypes. And so your textbook explicitly kind of confronts that by, addressing some of the negative terms that we associate with older people and aging. You know, and the negative kind of stereotypes that we have of the elderly, and a lot of those stereotypes are related to decline, the decline of their mental and physical capabilities, dependency, right? The idea that they can't be independent, they can't take care of themselves, that they need to be relying on family, or in some cases not even necessarily relying on family, but our sense that they are dependent on government and government assistance. And then just disability, right? Once again, that kind of idea that they are not able to be fully functioning, whether that's physical or cognitively. And so, it's not just that we believe these things, or we have kind of internalized these beliefs and attitudes, but then we use these beliefs and attitudes to kind of shape how we treat how we treat the elderly population in a variety of contexts, which is why if you think about the concept of age stratification, right, go back to our concept of social stratification, where we had our ladder and, the different rungs of social classes. Well, age stratification basically says that in our society, we prioritize and privilege certain age groups over other age groups. And so, I would say that middle-aged adults are probably, at the top of the ladder. We tend to think the most highly of people when they're at that age where we're expecting them to be working, contributing members of society, right? They're not teenagers who, we have our own stereotypes about teenagers, related to their maturity, related to their responsibility, related to their seriousness. But at the same time, the elderly are not at the top of the age stratification ladder, because we do have those negative stereotypes kind of related to their decline, their dependency, and their disability. So what does this then, how does this then play out? Well, one way it plays out is in workplace discrimination. So there is empirical evidence that suggests that, oftentimes people do discriminate in their hiring practices of older people. They're less likely to be hired for certain jobs. They're less likely to be considered, or if they are hired, they are less likely to be put in, to receive the same type of pay. Oftentimes because, businesses are just feel like they don't want to invest in someone who they expect will not be spending much longer in the labor force. Retirement, although there is not mandatory retirement in most occupations. Really the only occupation that I can think of off the top of my head that really does push people to retire by a certain age is air traffic controllers. But just because there isn't mandatory retirement does not mean that older people aren't pushed to retire, by their supervisors and by the kind of bureaucratic structures, that are in their place of employment. Whether that is, giving them bad shifts, or taking away responsibilities, or having them, train people that then, are placed in positions then above them. I remembered when that happened to my mother, when her business was kind of trying to push her towards early retirement. In some cases, if it's a more working class job, like, waitressing or bartending, they may not give people shifts, or not give them ideal shifts anymore where they'll make the most money. And so, all of that, kind of complicates the idea retirement being this great thing that people choose, because oftentimes in this country, when people have not adequately saved for retirement, retirement is less of a free choice and maybe more of a forced option. And that can be concerning for, reasons that we'll discuss in upcoming slides. Certainly, one way in which the elderly are vulnerable is in regards to healthcare. Your book talks about versus indirect ageism. And direct ageism is literally when healthcare procedures or treatments are denied to people because of their age, where they basically are just like, this. We're not going to do this type of procedure. Insurance will not cover this type of treatment because we just think that, a person at your age, this isn't necessary, this isn't cost efficient, or what have you. And then there's indirect ageism, where, it's not so much that people are directly denied healthcare on the basis of age, but they are treated and perceived differently, and they are given kind of different advice by healthcare practitioners, and a lot of that difference is related to their age, kind of being the factor that's influencing how they are being treated and being perceived by people in the healthcare field. Another aspect kind of related to the older population, has a lot to do with the fact that, particularly in America, with our baby boomer population, there is a lot of concern, as well as some, kind of negative sentiment directed towards that group, that because they are such a large group, that they are going to be a drain on the system, as they kind of shift from being working citizens to citizens who are retired and perhaps living to some extent off of governmental programs. Programs like Social Security and Medicare, although those are entitlement programs that people, pay into, one concern is that because of the size of that population, is throwing off our dependency ratio, meaning that there aren't as many young people, and the ratio of the number of young people who need to be working in order to cover the Social Security and Medicare costs of the older population who are no longer working or no longer working full time, that ratio gets thrown off. And that's where you hear people saying things like, Social Security won't be solvent, for the generations that are coming up, or, Social Security won't be around, or it will have to be dramatically restructured if we want it to be around for future generations. And that is because, of course, just kind of the shift of our kind of population demographics, just that we have a large population of elderly people and not necessarily enough working age people in order to make that math work. Certainly, because of just kind of the greater likelihood of experiencing illness as you age, healthcare is really important for this generation. And although Medicare is the entitlement program available to people over the age of 65, oftentimes people will have healthcare costs that go beyond what they're able to pay for. And so that is why Medicaid, which is a program that covers different categories of people who also are lower income. One of the protected categories is the elderly. So Medicaid is available, for the elderly poor. And certainly, we do not want the elderly poor, dying on the streets, unable to afford the healthcare that they need as they live out their lives. But once again, there is just this concern around that, because of, how do we pay for it? And once again, going back to that dependency ratio. The elderly are more likely to be, the victims of crime. That is a stereotype that they are, vulnerable and need protection. But that stereotype is rooted in a little grain of truth, that, the elderly population are much more likely to be the victims of crime than they are to be the perpetrators. And part of why they are more likely to be victimized has to do with that perceived vulnerability, that makes them, in people's minds, an easier target for a variety of crimes. And then there are just other kind of issues that come up with being elderly. There are issues with family problems, as they're perhaps having to kind of, adjust to changing power dynamics within the family as they, retire, perhaps becoming more financially dependent, and less financially independent on their own children or grandchildren. Their housing issues, and for the elderly that do not own their own homes, there is this concern about, okay, where will they live, especially if they don't have families to take them in and they're no longer working. And that's certainly a concern in large cities that have very expensive rents, like LA, which is why sometimes you will see fixed rent housing options for senior citizens, where they will require people to be a certain age to live there, and oftentimes the rent is a little lower because it's trying to address that very issue. And then there's just the concern of social isolation, which we'll talk about more when we talk about the disengagement theory. So this just is another kind of way of thinking about, how that dependency ratio can also vary by state, because there are states that have a much higher proportion of elderly people than other states. And so those green states are the states where, they have a high proportion of the elderly. Unsurprisingly, California is at the top of that list. But, those are oftentimes elderly people that have the resources and who chose to relocate in California. So we do not necessarily have some of those same concerns, regarding, housing and healthcare coverage, with that group of seniors as we maybe have for, the seniors who live in places like Maine or West Virginia or the Dakotas or New Mexico, because the elderly population in those states are more likely to be socially disadvantaged in regards to their financial situations. So, there is, at the same time, there is social age, and there is this shifting, fluctuating definition about, what does it mean to be old? When do you become old? There is also this biological aspect, and that biological aspect is, what contributes to some of those visible signs of aging. You have your graying hair, you develop wrinkles, there's a loss of height, there's muscle atrophy. But there's a social aspect to those changes as well, because how those changes are then perceived and evaluated in society, well, of course, that's based on, that's based in kind of social perception and social evaluation. And so in a lot of Western societies, those visible signs of aging are perceived in a negative light, particularly in those societies where the idealized body is young, and that says bit, but it should say fit, young and fit, in shape and athletic. And so in these societies that are very appearance driven, aging and the aging process can be particularly hard on women, because as your textbook notes, that they're more likely to be judged by their appearance, and evaluated, solely or mostly on their appearance than men. And as they age, just visibly, they're moving away from that socially constructed, standard of beauty or attractiveness that exists in that society. And so, what we see in a lot of higher income nations in particular as a response to that is that, there has been this like increased focus on fitness and cosmetic surgery and even dress, to kind of emphasize the shifting context around aging, and it really complicates the growing old gracefully ideology. If you live in a society where everyone around you is, getting a facelift, getting a neck lift, getting their body worked on, if you live in an area where the expectation is that Jennifer Lopez is 50. That is not how 50-year-old women were supposed to look 30, 40 years ago. But, now if it's that idea that you are supposed to, expend all of this effort as well as expend all these financial resources to hold on to this youthful appearance for as long as possible, that does say something about, what a society values, and the norms that they establish around those values, right? That's not necessarily, an inherent or stable aspect of society, but it does kind of reveal, where society currently stands on the process of aging. And so all of this kind of then, plays into, how we theorize about aging. How do we think people respond and make sense of the aging process or being older? So, one theory your book talks about is the disengagement theory, which suggests that as people reach old age, they gradually disengage from society in terms of their social contracts, their roles and responsibilities. And your book notes that this is based on a functionalist perspective, where people are largely, perceived through this lens where the focus is on their functionality. What role do you serve in society? But, your book also notes that this is an outdated view of aging, and it does provide some important criticisms of this theory. To what extent are people, just naturally, disengaging versus, to what extent are we forcing people, out by how we treat them or how we discriminate against them? In that sense, what we're presenting in the theory as it being just kind of a choice or just kind of nature, it really is social. And therefore, because it's social, we could as a society take steps to make this disengagement less likely. Another theory is the dependency theory, which argues that older people are constructed as dependent on the state, primarily through their exclusion from the paid labor force and dependence on government assistance. And that this exclusion is what is contributing to their social isolation, not necessarily that they are just naturally disengaging, but they are no longer in the labor force, which limits their social kind of circles, and they're dependent on government assistance, which gives them a fixed income, which limits their social interactions. And so, the dependency theory, kind of points the finger more to the social factors responsible for social isolation, while the disengagement theory kind of points the finger more at, the individual themselves. But both of them have a pretty kind of negative perception about, what it means to be older in society. And so the third theory, the concept of the third age, it is a much more kind of optimistic perspective of aging and being older. And so it calls for a reworking of how society views different life stages. With and it's talking about you kind of transitioning from your first age, childhood, to second age, middle years, to third age, late middle years, to early older age. And they kind of describe it as you move from being dependent as a child to independence, but responsibility, having a lot of responsibilities, and that's second age, your middle years. But then when you're in your third age, you're supposed to have this increased freedom and flexibility because you are no longer probably the primary, you're no longer raising children. And, the expectation is you're no longer, working full time at a job. So, but you still have these years of life left, and it's highly likely that you are in relatively good health. So you have this freedom and flexibility about, what do you want to pursue? What do you want to do with your life? And, there is evidence that, people, pursue dreams, and, they return to school, and, but the focus is on the idea that it's not that your life is over, you've reached this dead end, that you need to disengage from society. Third age concept kind of presents this as an opportunity, to kind of discover yourself, renew yourself. Now, but obviously, and your book does note this, third age is made possible by increasing numbers, affluence, and health of older people. And so therefore, this really positive kind of, conception, of the third age is less likely from those of lower SES backgrounds, just because their freedom and flexibility is going to be hindered by their lack of social resources. Now, as people live for longer periods of time, and as I've noted, as we've had that shift from acute illnesses to chronic illnesses, the fourth age was later added, to account for the fact that usually at some period, there is physical decline, there are health problems, even if they're not necessarily significant. But those types of issues do dominate the experience of those in deeper old age. So now we're talking about people that are 75 plus. Now, as great as the third age sounds, and it certainly offers a rosier, more optimistic, more positive view of aging, your book does, note that, there are criticisms of this concept. And one major criticism is that it's pretty data light. Meaning, we really haven't empirically, tested it, assessed it to see, how valid of a concept it is. Your book switches kind of focus then, as we're talking about, first age, second age, third age, to just a more popular or common view of talking about age, which is the life course. And so, they talk about this because they're wanting to emphasize that age is not just biological, it is shaped by these larger social factors. And this part of your textbook begins by, stating that there is this taken for granted association between aging, disability, and ill health. And although, this is socially constructed, that, those associations, those assumptions, it's not entirely inaccurate, because the fact of the matter is, you are most likely to die when you are older, and you are least likely to die, during, childhood to early adulthood. So there is this relationship between age and mortality. And age is actually the most important predictor of mortality. And it's also the most important predictor of morbidity, how sick you are, what illnesses you get, how serious those illnesses are, is related to your age. So I don't want to just say that those associations between aging, disability, and ill health are just kind of based on people's biases and prejudices, and they aren't based in any kind of, real data, because they are. However, because age is not just biological and it's shaped by larger social factors, it is very helpful to kind of approach this discussion of, health and aging by using the life course perspective. And so the life course perspective, and I found this little helpful graphic here. The key themes in the life course perspective is it focuses on the interplay of human lives and historical time, which your book calls biographical time and historical time. And it talks about how, the timing of our lives is how it's linked to other lives, to what extent human agency does and does not play in our choices. It emphasizes that, because of that biographical and historical link, there is diversity in our life course trajectories. So everyone's life does not turn out the exact same way, even if they're born at the same time. We still have unique biographies. And so, how does this help us understand older people's health? Well, the biographical element helps us see that not all older people are a homogeneous social group. They're going to have unique aspects in their personal biography that is influencing their health in ways that are unique to them, and that can be either a positive or a negative influence. For myself, as I'm reaching, knocking on 40's door, I in the last like probably 10 years, I've really focused a lot on healthy living and wellness, fitness, eating well, intermittent fasting, drinking more water, and I would like to believe, I guess maybe we would all like to believe, but I would like to believe that I'm doing these things because not just because I would like to live, longer, although I would, but also that I'm hoping that I will be living healthier, that I will be, staving off some chronic illnesses like hypertension or diabetes that, requires people, to take prescription drugs and, have limits and constraints kind of on their well-being, right? So, that is kind of a biographical element that I'm hoping will set me apart from other people my age in the next 20 to 30 years. But then there's also this historical element that helps us understand that people are part of a particular generation, which can shape their health beliefs. So, kind of my focus and fixation on fitness and, and I'll be honest, some of those cosmetic, surgeries and enhancements, certainly that's shaped by the fact that I am coming up in a generation where those types of procedures aren't just available, but they're promoted. I grew up, flipping through the magazines. I'm looking at people like Jennifer Lopez and Halle Berry, and it's like, oh, okay, I'm supposed to look this good for as long as possible into, my 50s even. So, that type of belief is shaped by the time period that I am, becoming middle-aged in. And so, both of these things, these elements of the life course perspective helps us understand why there is both this kind of like communal kind of social aspect to health and aging, but there's also kind of this individuated aspect. And your book notes, it is the human body on which the experiences of both biographical and historical time will be recorded in terms of good or bad health in later age. So, these opportunities as well as risk that our generation faces and confronts, but then also our own kind of individual, lives and narratives and actions, our bodies will kind of reflect, a mixture of both of those factors later in life. Now, the chapter does end by focusing on one condition that does disproportionately develop and affect older populations. So after emphasizing the fact that, aging is very individuated, it's biological and social factors do come into play. By emphasizing that, a lot of our preconceptions and biases, in regards to the elderly, are based less on empirical fact and more on broad stereotypes. The book does end by focusing on an ailment that does disproportionately affect older people, which is dementia. It is the major cause of disability in old age. There's 7.7 million new cases each year, the World Health Organization estimates. And that term dementia refers to a variety of degenerative conditions affecting the higher functions of the brain. There are over 100 different forms of dementia. Your book names Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, and Lewy bodies as the most common. And I give you a video on each, just in case. I was kind of interested in this material. This isn't something that you're going to be tested on, but perhaps if you would just like to learn more about it. Memory loss is probably one of the most known and troubling symptoms related to dementia. And so, they talk about dementia, clearly there's a biological basis, but, for sociologists who are interested in studying dementia, it really is those psychological and social impacts. And for sociology, particularly, is how dementia impacts our sense of who we are and how we relate to other people. So a real symbolic kind of interactionist perspective here. The fact is that almost a complete loss of memory leads to social death, because people, aren't sure how to treat you. The person that is suffering that loss of memory, often does not know, what is expected of them in social situations, how to respond, how to interact. And so much of our human social life is really kind of based on these large social scripts, where I respond to you in an expected way. And I know what's expected of me, and you respond to me in an expected way because you know what's expected of me. But imagine if your knowledge of those expectations went away, right? You wouldn't know how to respond. You would respond in erratic ways, and then I would know how to respond to that. And what often happens is people largely don't know how to interact in these situations. And your book does talk about the Sweeting and Gilhooly study, that details the different ways in which people can respond to a loved one's dementia. And we do know that how dementia is perceived by others is significant, because it impacts how we care for people with dementia. And so, I put those stills from the movie The Notebook. I don't know if you've seen it, but it kind of centers on this older couple. And it initially begins kind of with the perception that they don't really know each other, and he's telling her this story, and then it ends with you realizing, as she realizes, that the story is them, it's their love story, but she is suffering from dementia and has forgotten this. And her husband is kind of committed to getting her to remember at least once a year. And obviously a very fictionalized, romanticized account, but as the World Health Organization establishes, this is a reality, for a lot of elderly people in our world, but certainly not all older people. And I think that's really the big takeaway here. What it means to be older in the early part of the 21st century is quite different from other times. Being older now can be, for those with the requisite resources, a phase in life where ambitions and life goals are realized. Old age does not automatically mean poverty and deprivation. And that's pages 199 to 200. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean, poor health, or disease or disability. So just once again, that idea of not really thinking about the elderly as this kind of homogeneous group where their life experiences are all the same, because that would be inaccurate perception. And so for people that, just so you know, this is a growing popular subfield of study in social sciences. And so you'll hear about gerontology, or sometimes it's called social gerontology. So if this is something that you are really interested in, if you're really interested in the elderly population, just know that there are opportunities for further study, if you want to go on and get additional education in that field. And there is expected to be, job opportunities related to this population, just because of the sheer size and the relatively long lives of people who are part of the baby boomer generation. And so that's it for this chapter.